Hi, I'm Craig Dumont with Dr. Mark Barber, and we are continuing our conversation through the book of Acts, and sometimes it even goes on to other things before that. But anyway, Mark, where are we at today?
All right, well,
We're making good headway here.
well, it depends after, 100 videos or whatever we got, whether you call that headway, but we're going to start reading today in Acts 22 and 10, which is going back a couple verses from last week, and we will now move forward. So Acts 22, starting with verse 10. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus, and one Ananias, a devout man, according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came unto me, and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. And the same hour I looked upon him, and he said, The God of our fathers has chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and to see the just one, and shouldest hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men, what thou hast seen and heard. And now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling upon the name of the Lord. It came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even when I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying unto me, Make haste, and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of those that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voice and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes, they threw dust in the air. And the chief captains commanded him to be brought into the castle, and that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. And I will stop there for now, because it's an interesting conversation that comes afterwards. Paul taking his privilege as a Roman citizen to avoid a beating, probably to keep the centurion and the Chiliarch, or the chief commander, out of trouble. Paul had taken plenty of beatings before, and he'd already just been beaten, by the Jews. So, but not to saying that anybody should want to go get beaten. But let's go back to a little bit. We're talking. He recounts his conversion, and we talked last week that each of the three conversion accounts gives us a little bit more detail, and we put them together, and we talked about the idea is that the people that were with Paul, they saw a light, they heard a sound, but they couldn't make heads nor tails because they were still blinded. You think about Isaiah 6, and it says, "See and do not,
Right.
do not see, and hear and do not perceive." Other words, and it talks about a hardening. So that they could not put two and two together. It wasn't to them, at least not yet at this time, that they should hear his voice. That's what Paul said. That the Lord said to hear his voice and to know his will. And so obviously there was something strictly to Paul in that revelation that he understood fully. And to the others, they understood that Paul had seen something, and they knew that Paul couldn't see, and he had to be led by the hand. He was Now, whether he was dark blind or light blind, it almost sounds like the scales coming off his eyes. What I said before, that if you looked at it for a physical effect, it would be almost like instant cataracts. You know, how sunlight can cause your lenses all to cloud over, scale over. Now that would just be a speculation.
Yeah.
Just know he had to be led by the hand because he could no longer see in this life. But it was granted to him that he would see the Lord, that he would hear the voice of the Just One, and that he would know the will of God. You see, those are the three. And so they lead him to Damascus, and we talked a little bit about that in the last video. And he talked to go to see somebody named Ananias, who he lives on Straight Street. We know the first time that brings it up that Ananias wasn't all that enthusiastic.
No, he was walking into what he thought was
a trap.
Well,
What a better trap! What a better trap to find who the believers are, than to pretend that you're a believer, to infiltrate the believers, so then he would know who to arrest. You know, if everybody was afraid, as soon as they saw Paul, they would be, well, maybe we need to hold things off for a few days, and lest we be persecuted and taken to jail. And Paul says that he led many people to death, but the only one person he mentions here is that he was consenting to the death of Stephen by keeping the cloak. He didn't mention the others. He did mention being in prison and beating, but we need other sources from Paul that there probably were others that...
he was notorious.
So he says he wasted the church of God. And they listened to his conversion.
I mean, Mark, is so, you and I think, we read over this too easy sometimes, but I mean, going back to the original account when it happened, I mean, Ananias is like, he hears God, right? So you think that would be enough, but he's like, are you sure, God? Are you positive? I mean, this guy is, you really know.
We know about this fella and why he's come.
Yeah.
In other words, there's been a leak, intelligence leak here, that he's come to do us in. Are you sure? It says, well, go do this because he's a chosen vessel.
Yeah.
And, and here the idea of his being appointed, is brought out again, that, he's appointed to a ministry and you're to do it. He's now on our side, not the Jews' side.
Hey, Mark, this, before we get too far on here, I just want to put, you and I have talked many times about the importance of baptism.
We're going to get there in a minute.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's kind of interesting that Paul even reiterates that again in his conversion. But okay, go ahead.
Well, the next thing he says, he comes in and Ananias obeys the Lord. Brother Saul, receive your sight. And then he looked up onto Ananias. And then it mentions, his sight is restored. And it's very important here. It says, to be baptized and wash away your sins. Now that's where we were headed. So let's bring it up. You were anticipating where to go, when we talked throughout the importance of baptism.
Yeah.
And here, it reinforces the baptism to wash away your sins. Now,
Mark, just for a second, I just want to. There's something contemporary. Right now that's happening in the news. We don't need to comment other than just point out how, just to put a little exclamation mark on the baptism at Auburn University. That's a state university in Alabama. At Auburn University, literally hundreds of college students now are confessing Christ and being baptized. The big thing is that there's just this way people are being baptized, and just one other thing. I don't know his whole backstory, and I don't know where he is spiritually, but Russell Brand
I heard that.
just got baptized, and so when we're talking about this, it just brings to my mind that what a spectacular type of event and testimony that must be. Because right now it's like people are looking with shock and awe at this stuff. At least I am. I'm going, wow, what is God doing? But
here, let's talk about this aspect: washing away your sin.
Yeah.
as being one of the things that baptizing does. It's not saying symbolizing that you have already had your sins washed away. It's part
you're
of
entering into deep water here.
it's
so
part,
to speak.
it's part of the process. Now, it shouldn't be controversial. Yes, you're saved by grace through faith.
Yeah.
And we can quote Paul until we're blue in the face.
Yeah.
We're saved. But how does the book of Romans begin and end? It says unto the obedience of faith. You see, the faith brings forth obedience. So one of the first acts of obedience upon having faith is that you make public confession at baptism. That it does confess that Christ died and rose again. I mean, baptism is a very rich. It's kind of like the second circumcision. The replacement of circumcision allows women to be, full participants in the kingdom as compared to being just married to, the men, and hoping the men will let you rise on resurrection day, which is what the Jews believed.
Well, yeah, but that was a real late development. That you don't find any evidence of that.
No, I'm not saying there's no biblical warrant. I'm saying what the Jews believed, and which was a mixture of a lot of things, including some of the Bible. I mean, they certainly love to quote it, whether they meant or understood it. In other words, Paul knew a lot about the Bible.
Yeah.
But it says that he should learn the will. I mean, all that study Paul had done, at Gamaliel's feet, and whatever he might have learned at Tarsus from the philosophers or whatever, that he should know his will. You think that all the reading, he ought to know what the will of God is, but there's this blindness that sometimes we have just because we affirm that the scriptures are God-breathed. Sometimes we're blind to what the scriptures mean. In other words,
well, that's what Paul said, that he persecuted church ignorantly. He didn't. I mean, his eyes weren't opened at that time, right? That's what he says.
That's
okay.
That's
Mark. And I promised I wouldn't, but you mentioned something about the washing away of sins. Talk a little bit more about that.
all right. Now, modern people take two things they want to downplay. They would say baptism is important.
Mm-hmm.
They might fight over the mode of baptism, but it's almost like, well, that's not what's important. What's important, the thief on the cross was not baptized.
Right.
And I know the Catholic doctrine says he was baptized in blood, like the shedding of your blood is going to replace the washing. And and we talk about the exceptions, but the exceptions kind of prove the rule. Now, it doesn't mean that this, who knows what God did in the darkness? Maybe it rained on the poor fella.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But here is my feeling on baptism. It says the obedience of faith. That, yes, maybe if you're saved and the opportunity for baptism does not arise because you're impending immediate death, that's one thing. But to say I believe in Jesus Christ and refuse baptism, you are denying that you are a Christian. That's how important it is. And we put it off like dirty laundry. We'll baptize you in the spring.
Paul says it because we mentioned that he gives this account several times, but he specifically adds. It's not just that he says be baptized. He adds right here in this later account.
Yeah,
about washing away the sin.
And that's what's important, because a lot of people quote Paul in the 1 Corinthians. I thank God I baptized none of you, as though baptism was
then he goes and lists like 3 or 4 people that he baptized.
As though baptism itself was secondary.
Right.
But I think what we have to read is that Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. And Paul's reason for not doing a lot of the baptizing is to show that baptism is from the Lord and it's administered by the church. And you're not baptized in the name of Paul or Apollos or
that's it. Yes.
or Cephas or that you're not becoming a disciple of me. You're becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so
that's a really good point, because even today we kind of have a different version of that floating around today. I mean, perhaps some people want to be baptized by famous people, but I mean, there's this, I mean, you know, there's a lot of people who think that there's extra significance by going to, you know, being baptized in the Jordan River even, and things like that.
Well, you know, the idea that there's a lot of people who say, I baptized so-and-so, in other words, and they became my followers. That's what Paul would be strongly objecting to.
Okay.
And even, you know, why didn't Jesus baptize, but his disciples?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's this, but they baptized.
Right.
In fact, they were baptizing more people than John was baptizing. So
what? But Mark, I mean, to follow up on that, and again, I just find it fascinating that Paul thinks it's so important again that he reiterates it. What is it? I mean, what does it mean by wash? I mean, is there? Okay, it's not a symbol, like you said. It's got to be more. It's more than a symbol. I mean, it's sacramental.
but
right?
is is the act of baptism regenerate one? That's the argument in the church. It's called you're saved because you're baptized.
Right. Yeah. I'm not saying that, but what? I mean, I can see how it all ties together. But if it's not that, what is it?
All right, well, let's go through. We're going a lot through patristics and here's and also Roman Catholic theology that and infant baptism in particular. That infant baptism washes away what's called original sin.
Okay.
Now, original sin is the guilt and the penalty given to Adam and Eve, which is a whole human race, that it must die.
Okay.
The death penalty.
Right.
Universal.
Everybody is born into sin, and that's our state.
And and we can argue, in whom, through whom, whatever out of Romans 5, whichever way you want to argue it. The one thing that's for certain, all of sin that comes short of the glory of God. There is, yes, I think it's transmitted biologically because not that it's entirely biological, but everything in the cursed realm of humanity is affected, including genetics.
Yeah, I agree.
So you can say, well, that person that was born blind, it wasn't individual sin, but he still was participating in the curse. Now, it's interesting when you go to the idea, what were the crown of thorns about?
Well, the Bible talks about in the early days, about the thorn. You talking about that? Or
about the thorns. In other words, Jesus on the cross bears the curse.
Okay.
Now, the curse there is of the, and what will be healing eventually in the kingdom is that the land will be healed, the fruits will provide their fruit, the water, it'll be the river that waters the fruit trees again, and it's a reversal curse. But we have to understand, when we talk about washing away your sin, now, to some degree, you can say that infant baptism, this is what the Catholics would believe, is the washing away of original sin. But I think to the Roman Catholics, that's all it is.
Yeah.
Effectively, because if you weren't baptized as an infant, yes, you can be baptized upon your conversion, because everybody must be baptized. But if you were baptized as an infant, someone else church is a sponsor. They promise to disciple you, your parents, or maybe you have a sponsor family or whatever, are going to sponsor you with baptism to raise you in the faith, and in that way you have a similar idea to circumcision. You say that's it. That child has committed no individual sin. He's just born a sinner, and there's the sin of the washing away of original sin, and then there's the idea that is there more? It was Paul. He had a lot of sins that needed to be washed away, and we get into this argument.
So, Mark, would it be? Let me with communion. Communion. There's been a lot of fights over communion, but. Which is interesting because actually communion is supposed to bring us together, right? So is baptism, right? One body, we're baptized.
Communion means to come together as one. Now, it's called Eucharist, call the
Right.
Eucharist in
But
Greek terms.
with the bread and the wine, okay, there's no doubt that that there is an element of symbolism there, okay? But it also is very real. I mean, you eat it. Paul said, "You eat and drink to your death." I mean, some of you become sick and die because of this, because you're not relating properly to the body of Christ. So there's some, and then the opposite side, which never anybody talks about, is, you know, Jesus talked about eating it for life and for joy and for and for life in Christ. So the benefits are just immense. We scare people with the curse so many times, but there is something that is tangible at the Lord's table with the bread and the wine. So I guess my question would be here. So what you're saying, I think, is that there is something that is tangible that takes place. There is some type of initiation into the new covenant that really takes place.
It's not just pure. Let's say in Baptist terms, you don't call them sacraments. You call them ordinances, okay?
Yeah,
And when you talk about ordinances, that you're talking about, you just do it because God said to do it, and that's it. You know, we celebrate the Lord's Supper because it says do it as often as you drink it. Well, that will make the term oft as once a quarter, once a year.
That's not your view, though, right?
No, it's frequent communion. I think they broke. Frankly, if it were my choice, we'd have communion with every church service, but.
Yeah.
You know, I can't. You
No, I agree with you. I think that's sad important. Okay, I'm sorry to have went that far, but I just think, I mean, as we've talked about this a lot in the past, as we go through the book of Acts, and we see Paul again place an emphasis there, and then combined with what's just been happening lately around the country and the world, it just makes me think, you know. Maybe anyway.
Just to sum up what I'm saying is that, you know, Paul is converted on the way to Damascus. Then he is baptized.
Right.
It's baptized and then you are converted.
I'm sorry.
And now that gets a little difficult with with what's called infant baptism. I realize that Methodist Church practice it, and then they forbid rebaptism.
I don't know how you can get away from it because the Bible talks about it.
No, it doesn't. It says and his house.
Yeah. Okay.
And then there's a comparison of baptism to circumcision, which is done on the 8th day when the child. And you also deal with a certain amount of election theology,
Right.
where it says appointed.
Right.
I have chosen you, and
or at least covenant. Type theology.
I'm going to say that it's a thorny issue.
Yeah.
And I think you can go wrong on both ways.
Yeah.
I want to nuance it this way, is that yes, ordinance, it says to be baptized. It's important just because God said to do it.
Yeah.
Now that alone should tell you that if he says to, as often as you drink it, the cup, or baptism, that it ought to be done. That's important. Now you get into the question: does baptism save you? Well, if you read Peter, you would get a pretty strong implication they're saved through baptism. And Paul talks about the children of Israel being baptized in the Red Sea.
Peter Lightheart makes a very, very good point on baptism. I've got his book. It's really interesting. I wouldn't say I agree with everything, but he says that it is a rite that conveys a legal type of an aspect. So, for instance, you can live together. A man and a woman can live together without being married. But they're not married, right? What makes a marriage is that when you come together, and what
before
what
God
today,
and witnesses,
and what
pledge your
today,
faith.
what sexual activity you engaged in before you were married was unlawful and sinful. That when you go through the rite of marriage, it becomes, and you're married, it becomes lawful and productive the day after. So there's something that really does transpire.
Well, there's always, even if you go to the act of salvation itself, when you come to faith, there's a time you're an unbeliever, and there's a time you're saved.
Okay.
And there was a time that Jesus died on the cross. There's in real time that he rose from the dead. You just can't talk about some nebulous Christ event, such as what that Barber would talk about. There may have been a resurrection. I hear that all the time. But that doesn't matter. It's in other words, the biggest thing is a changed life, or and you're now living a different life, and you're inspired as though Jesus died on the cross. So this. So you have to understand that Christ comes into time. He becomes flesh. He lives amongst us. He's rejected. He suffers on the cross. He dies, is buried. He rises the third day. He's coming back. He intercedes for us. He's coming back to judge the quick and the dead. Now these are going to happen because Jesus came into our historical time.
Right.
Now time is as we understand it, is a fallen construct. Now, obviously...
What makes it fallen?
Makes it fallen because we are mortal.
Okay.
Now, it's not that God created time at creation to be this way, but the part of the curse on time is we only can understand time as a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to do this, and a time to do that. And it's in other words, when he comes into flesh, he comes into a cursed world. And all of a sudden, he's born into fallen time. Not that he's a fallen person, but, and I guess the question is, was when Jesus was born, if he hadn't been, of course you can't say if he hadn't been, because, that's like saying that God's plan can be thwarted. It's a ridiculous thing, because he came for that purpose. But would Jesus have died?
Or there was just it was alternative to actually,
Would Jesus have died a normal death when he came into flesh? Now that's what makes the speculation wrong is because is the word appointed, elected, chosen. In other words, there was no other way that Jesus was going to die other than on the cross, on the Passover. Every other opportunity they had, they took up stones to stone him. His hour was not yet. He was born for that particular hour. So to try to say, to what degree but Christ was born into what I call mortal time or cursed time. Now, he existed before time, and you can say that even when God created time before it was fallen, it's a concept of time we can't understand. We were talking how long before Adam and Eve sinned. I don't know. That's a question of whether that 930 years determines the.
You're wrong on that topic, and I'm right.
I'm not saying right. I'm not going to talk about right or wrong. I'm saying that whatever time. Unfallen time Adam and Eve were created. Time does not get numbered until the fall. And then you always have these words, and he lived so many years, he maybe begat a son at such an age, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died, which, indicates the limits of time. And I don't want to get, once you get into, you want to read Augustine's City of God, and you want to get thoroughly
that is a mammoth
to
work.
go thoroughly mad. It's somewhere near the middle of the book, somewhere in around page 740 of 1,560 pages of small print.
That's a work that is quoted all the time, but nobody ever reads, including me. I've quoted and I've read sections. That's a mammoth work. That's a mammoth work.
I haven't finished reading it. I've read about half of it.
So Mark, so there's this. So Paul is going through here, and essentially what he's doing is he's preaching the good. He's really preaching the good news, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, he's preaching his testimony is literally a gospel revelation.
Yes.
And he's not. again, he's not pulling some punch or anything. He's
That
just
he-
coming out here.
That he should know my will, and he should see me, hear me,
Yeah.
and know.
Okay.
Now, essential experience of washing away, and and we talked a little bit about it. So, but let's go on to what happens next. Now, it's a little bit fuzzy between the first and second conversions when he goes to Damascus. We know that that he has creates a riot in Damascus and has to be let down by a basket, by the new brethren down the city wall. Then he goes to Jerusalem. It's not, that part of it's not mentioned here.
Mm-hmm.
What is mentioned is that he does go to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And the early book of Acts does mention that he goes to Jerusalem, but it leaves out, the rejection at Damascus in order to bring out the emphasis here, his rejection at Jerusalem, because he's at Jerusalem right now. And what's important here is to bring out the fact this is not the first time I've been rejected here. And to go to Jerusalem in that as an idea is to be accepted by some and rejected by many.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul says this is not the first time I've raised riot here. And he says I was here and I was praying and all of a sudden the Lord tells me get out of here because they will not accept your testimony, which is kind of implies they're not going to accept your testimony here today either. They're not going to be any more receptive. But at this point, they were all ears. They were silent and they were respectful. They were happy if they could have lived with, I don't know if happy, but they would have permitted Paul to say, well, I had this Jewish Christian experience and now I'm a good Jew. It talks about Ananias being a devout Jew and held in high reputation amongst the Jews.
Of the high regard, he was law. I mean, it mentions about the law. I'm thinking that, and I'm thinking that Jesus would say, a devout man according to the law. Mm-hmm. So everything's unfolding.
And so at this point, they're willing to accept. Well, maybe they'd heard Ananias. Maybe he was and they said, well, at least in the Pharisee sect. There probably, there was a division in the Pharisees too, but there was at least some Pharisees who were willing to give Paul a hearing. Mm-hmm. And remember, he is speaking in the Hebrew tongue.
You're right. Okay.
And
so that plays into the next part because the chief captain can't understand a word he's saying, right?
Right. Probably not very much anyway.
Yeah.
Now, some of the soldiers, in order for control, knew just like. Queen Elizabeth knew enough English to command her servants, but she spoke almost exclusively in Latin or French. Oh. And the French was the language of the court, in the English court, all the way up to after the time of James I.
So Mark, I guess a question would be, so they're quiet while he's talking about all this. Mm-hmm. What sets them off
is I will send you
to the Gentiles.
Far away to the...
So does that mean that they would have been happy with the message, as long as it was theirs?
Well, let's put it this way: happy some may have been happy as long as it was exclusive to the Jews.
Okay.
But remember, before Stephen said nothing about preaching to the Gentiles.
Right.
Now he does.
They did say that they killed the prophets.
Well, he does. He's pretty strict, and remember, he's a Hellenistic Jew.
Yeah.
And not a Pharisee Jew.
Right. Okay.
And Greek speaking, they were somewhat compromised in the pure eyes of the Pharisees anyway. Yeah. And he got into trouble but he also mentions, that they had mixed their religion with the Remphem, the star god, or whatever it was, and. And were sent to exile for their great sin. So he had plenty and they were gnashing their teeth and they were mad, but it was when I see Jesus standing at the right hand of God. That was the final straw.
Yeah.
They were rushing him to kill him. But so you
Paul gets a little bit farther than that, though. But
Paul is now saying, "I'm going to send." And Yahweh would never say, "I'm sending you." to the Gentiles, especially in the light of the fact the Jews had rejected Jesus. Now, the Pharisees and more the Hellenistic Jews did proclaim in the world, the Roman world, they in the synagogues who had God-fearers, and so somebody must have told some Gentiles something about the God of Israel. There's only one true God, and these people were God-fearers, and they were also, you get the Ethiopian eunuch is there, but he buys a scroll of the prophet Isaiah.
Yeah.
And so, there was some sense that God used the Hellenistic synagogues as a means of let's say, proto-gospel, or so that when Paul would come, the Gentiles would already be, some of the Gentiles would already be clued in onto the God of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they weren't, and at Athens he has to take a different tact. He's biblical about quoting the scriptures directly because they didn't, so there's this idea of, knowing your audience. Mm-hmm. Although Paul did preach Jesus in the synagogues of Athens. Right. And a few Jewish women believe, but it was probably one of the least fruit of any, at least directly. Yeah. The least fruit of any of his places that he had. And the rejection was also less, he was humiliated, or tried to humiliate him, but there was no physical punishment for Paul, unlike many other places where he was stoned or beaten or suffered all kinds of violence or threatened with violence. So the thing that sets him off here is and what set it off the whole riot, because they said he brought Trophimus, a Gentile, into the temple. That was right. And we had heard that he says to the Jews, don't keep the customs anymore, don't circumcise your children, don't teach them Jewish laws and customs. This is the cause of their angst. And so now, as soon as he says that, that's the end of the, just like when he said in Athens to the Gentiles, says, a man by whom, by the resurrection of the dead, that God has appointed him to be the judge of all matters. And that's when they said, we will hear you later on this perhaps. And that was the end of, Paul didn't have to, didn't have any place else to go. They were done with hearing him. Mm-hmm. So it's not just Jewish rejection. I want to point out that acceptance of Jesus Christ is not because you're a Jew or not because you're a Gentile, it's because you believe on Jesus. There are Jewish believers, there are Gentile believers, there are Jewish unbelievers, and there are Gentile unbelievers. And some of the rejection that the church has gone through is suffered greatly at the hands of false Jews, and also suffered greatly under the hands of Gentiles. And it's not here to try to divide Jews and Gentiles.
There's only one man. I mean, that, in fact, Paul always takes it back to Adam. He doesn't start with Abraham. I mean, he uses Abraham, but he takes it back.
He'll start
to Adam.
You'll see in apostolic preaching, it goes back to Abraham when you're talking to Jews. It goes back to creation when you're talking to Gentiles, because the Jews accepted the creation account. It was the special purpose that Abraham had in history. And so it becomes the means of, that's Paul's starting point with the Jews. It's because the Jews accepted God as creator. The Gentiles, for the most part, did not. The closest you came to creation doctrine amongst the Gentiles is the prime unmoved mover. Right. Other words, which nobody can know anything about. It's and so that's, and that tells you a little bit about evangelism and how we would approach it. But today the common denominator isn't. You don't have a Christian culture of kids that are raised in Sunday school anymore. There's some, and to that audience you can maybe start a little further down the road than you can. But a lot of people have never heard of Jesus except as a cuss word, or whatever you've heard about Jesus was entirely defamatory, or at best, a good teacher, an out-of-date teacher. And it was okay back then, but now we've been enlightened.
Yeah, today what people think about Jesus is that he was a good man with good teeth. I was reading a commentator the other day was talking about if the way he lived his life was if he had to live in the presence of Jesus or the Buddha, how would they? And I'm thinking, Jesus and the Buddha. What are you even talking about?
Well, let's look. Go back to the trial, the trial of Jesus. That there were two people that were involved. One is called Barabbas.
Oh, you're okay. You're talking about with Jesus.
Jesus' trial.
Okay.
And Barabbas means son of the Father. Now, if you go to, it's a C reading, which means, in the Greek text, maybe it should be or shouldn't be. It says Ho Jesus, Ho Barabbas. The Jesus Barabbas. So you have Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, son of the Father. It makes now. One was a political revolutionary and Messiah, and the other was the one that says, instead of us conforming to your expectation of Messiah, you're expected to conform to me. And you know which ones the Jewish people pick, but Barabbas is a false Christ.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people today that want to believe the false Christ. However that false Christ is presented, one that meets the expectations. God is a God of absolutely gooey love. He wants everybody's going to heaven. And, maybe he's a little disappointed with us, but that's all right. We're all going to heaven, and we're going to be one big happy family fighting World War IV up there.
Yeah.
Now,
which is, by the way, if anybody, everybody says, well, we just want to follow the teachings of Jesus. Jesus taught the exact opposite. Unless you believe in me.
Obviously, you've got to be very selective.
Yeah, like Thomas Jefferson. Well, yeah.
You got to be very selective of what Jesus. But the idea of the real Jesus and the Barabbas Jesus, and a lot of people today are more happy. Jesus, the liberation theologian, that would be the direct descendant of Barabbas.
Yeah.
Or the Jewish people are saying, is the Messiah alive on this earth today? And as people all trying to think maybe I'm the one that's going to be Messiah. What's the Jewish idea of Messiah is going to be, we're going to throw all the Palestinians out, and we're going to establish from the river to the sea a Jewish homeland, even though 3/4 of the Jews are atheists.
Yeah.
And only a small percentage of the Jews are Christian. And we say from the river to the sea, and then from there they're going to rule the whole earth. Now, in a sense, if you talk about the bankers, through the bankers, they pretty much do rule the whole earth. I'm not saying
that'll get you canceled. You're not allowed to say something like that.
They're not alone. I'm saying, you have a lot of. You got the Vatican Bank, and you've got a lot of people who call themselves Christians, and other people that are involved in the banking
unrighteousness, no bounds
in the cartel. And I'm not saying the Jewish people didn't suffer greatly during the Holocaust. In fact, they did, and the unfortunate thing is there were a lot of Judases.
But by the way, you mentioned, I think last week, this is just another culturally a time thing that I'm just mentioned. It's in the news right now. You mentioned Soros had made a bunch of money by betraying his own people to the Nazis. Mm-hmm. He's back in the news. He's the one that's underwriting all these Palestinian protests against Israel today.
Yeah,
he's bankrolling them all.
Well, look, I'm neutral. Not that I'm not concerned. I am concerned, but ultimately I'm called to proclaim the good news to Jews and the Gentiles, and to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And to get involved in these political controversies. But I'm not blind. If God has the same standard of righteousness as far as this world is concerned.
Yeah.
And, the Jewish people were removed twice before for their unbelief. And I'm not denying that the Jewish nation doesn't have a place in the last days prophecy. But it may be considerably different than our prejudices about it.
Yeah.
Now, and I think this is something that Christians should not just simply take for granted, that whatever the Jewish nation does is okay. and just any more than
No,
it
I
was
agree.
back here.
Yeah.
That this, what the Sadducees and the Pharisees were doing was okay.
Well, it's kind of interesting because, you know, the Bible talks about if you love the Lord, if you're following Him, I mean, one of the promises is that you are going to have peace with your neighbors. In other words, your borders are going to be at peace. If
And
there's
you'll have
anyone,
one law for you and one law for the stranger,
Yep.
and you'll treat the stranger
Yep.
as your neighbor.
yep, and
That's
if there
what
is
the law
anything that is
says.
contrary to that right now.
Well, you know, I don't.
Yeah.
I mourn for all the great suffering that's
Oh,
come
yeah.
upon. And just remember, a lot of Christians have died in Gaza too,
Oh, man.
being bombed, and you know, they have less privilege.
Churches
So,
eradicated.
including some that have been around for 1,800 years, have been bombed into oblivion, with the Muslims and whatever. I'm just saying that we need to be very, very careful. God's standard of righteousness is, if anything, the Jewish nation is more accountable for its sin than anybody. Then, of course, the real truth is the Christians are the most culpable. The Christians that sin, you know, having had the greater revelation, are actually to be beaten with the most stripes. And you know, I'm not picking on all the people who are Jewish anymore. Here, you know, there's a lot of Jewish people got carried up with the crowd, saying away with him, you know, who really didn't understand any more than the people on the day that Jesus was, what should I do with Jesus? You know, crucify him. But, you know, you see that the crowds are stirred up the same way with Jesus as they are with his followers.
Right.
If they listen to me, they'll listen to you. And if they rejected me, they're going to reject you also.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this riot breaks out. As soon as he says, send you to the Gentiles, that was the trigger. You know, we got a little bit of a hint, even that could have been a problem in the church, where it says these people, there's people in my church, you know, James is the pastor, I'm not accusing James of being, of promoting, you know, although he was a very devout Jew in all ways, that he was responsible for what some of the believers in the church, but they're zealous for the law is important, because here it is, they're zealous, the people outside the camp are zealous for the law. So I have the idea that zealous for the law here is zealous for the law in the wrong way. Now Ananias was, you know, and was zealous for the law in the right way and became a Christian. Paul was zealous for the law in the wrong way, and then when he became a Christian, because you know, becoming a Christian is the only thing that allows you to be a true Jew and part of Israel and part of the true covenant. You can't deny Jesus and be a covenant and be part of the covenant of God. So and I am really walking way out, because I know I'm going against probably 80 or 90% of evangelical Christians, and most of all people like John Hagee, by saying that. You know, we got to be careful thinking that somehow the Jewish people are going to be saved just because they're Jews by election, and the Gentiles are saved by grace, and that they're lesser Christians and they're going to be the carriers of water and the hewers of wood like the Gibeonites of old. Yeah. That's not the case.
Yeah. And you and I have, you know, good-naturedly differed on eschatology. You know, I think that too many Christians have their eyes on Israel for the end times when the Bible puts it on the church. I mean, Jesus talks about coming after, you know.
Well, you know, if you look at going back to the Reformation, when there was no nation of Israel anymore, they saw the seven hills as being Rome and the Roman Catholic Church, and the Pope was the Antichrist, and you know, and the whole system was an Antichrist system. You know, the thing, the Book of Revelation talks about two cities. It talks about Jerusalem and Rome, and you know, and doesn't say very flattering things about either. It calls Jerusalem Sodom, where our Lord was crucified. I mean, it doesn't get much. It doesn't get much worse than that.
Right.
And of course, Rome does not come out all that well either.
So, that's. I mean, we could go on and on about eschatology, but here, Paul. I mean, I mean, there is a real hatred for like you mentioned, there's a real hatred for the Gentile, because it seems to me like they're happy
There is
to listen to him as long as.
Yeah. Now,
But
anytime, but remember, the Gentiles was the trigger word for Paul's arrest.
Right.
And the whole idea is that they were willing to accept Gentiles, to some degree, as long as they would get circumcised, agree to keep the law of Moses, and wait 10 generations for full membership.
Yeah.
And meanwhile they could.
By the way, 10 generations in the Old Testament. There
300 years.
There was some nationalities that could be integrated in within like three generations, and then there were some that was more. I mean, God had this list of.
And there were some that were never, including Moab, Ruth.
Yeah.
Father, great grandmother of David or whatever.
Yeah.
Obed, Jesse, David. Yeah.
The great grandmother.
Whatever it is.
Anyway, yeah, you're right. So the Jews actually by the time this comes around, they're rolling into the very extreme part of it.
I understand. That's when we talked about this in the Matthew study in the genealogy. You can go back to the first, I guess maybe it's the second video. We talked about the genealogy of Jesus in the Matthew study, and talked about the fact he included 3 Gentile women in David. David's ancestry, plus one other who was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, another Gentile, and saying that, and talking about, here we have people that were totally cursed, that were incorporated into the genealogy of David, who was their star.
So how did Jews deal with that?
Well, this is what I think, part of what Matthew addresses.
Yeah.
Is that the church is the true Israel.
Yeah.
And that even by the Pharisaic understanding, that how does the Pharisee talk about the pure blood of David? They were racial purists. How do you account for Tamar? How do you account for Rahab? And especially, how do you, explicitly Ruth? No child of Moabite shall ever. Well, the thing is.
It actually says go into the temple.
It says shall ever be admitted into the congregation of Israel.
Wasn't it? But that was. Didn't that mean the going in?
That was it. There wasn't any temple then.
Okay.
I think it goes back to the tabernacle.
Okay.
But
okay.
It's to be a member of the congregation. But the whole idea ever. And and the only thing is that the way you can explain that is what makes one a Canaanite and what makes one a Moabite is you're not a believer, or maybe a Satan in a positive sense. That once Tamar, was imperfectly as she did it, she became a part of the congregation of Israel. In other words, Jesus does not become unclean by touching the unclean.
Right.
Jesus touches the unclean and makes them clean.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we have the same idea here, is that once you become a believer in the Lord of the covenant, the one that spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and gave the law, the one that spoke with Abraham, Jesus the Son, the angel of the Lord, and you can say, well, is that Father, is that the Son, or the Holy Spirit? And it says, well, it really doesn't matter, because they all are one. I do think that what we see in the Old Testament appearance of Jesus, we see angel of the Lord. We're not talking about an angel, we're talking about the Lord himself in the Old Testament appearance. Because all of a sudden they see the angel of the Lord, Manoah sees it descending, and we're dead, we're doomed, we've seen Yahweh. So, obviously the angel of the Lord, if it was separate, then Jesus ate with Abraham, ate bread and food in the presence of Abraham. So, at the very least, you cannot,
Mark,
be a member of the covenant and deny the Lord of the covenant.
Right. Mark, remind me the Moabites. Remind me, weren't they relatives? They were Lot's, right?
They were descendants of Lot.
Right.
Ammon and Moab.
Okay, so
but they did not, when Israel came out from Egypt, they did not allow them passage through their lands. And this is what led to the curse about Moabites is Moabites
Yeah.
will never be enter the congregation of the Lord.
But it is interesting.
Even to the 10th generation.
Right. So, but it is interesting that they were relatives of Abraham.
Everybody in the Middle East.
No, it's just funny that you've got a descendant. In fact, it was a who was it? It was a descendant of one of maybe one of Abraham's sons that he had with Keturah, who bought Joseph and sold him into slavery. I forgot what.
Well, it was an Ishmaelite, I thought, or
was
it was
it?
Midianites.
No, it was a Midianite. And,
All right, so let's
you've got-
and of course there was Ishmaelites involved in there somewhere too.
yeah.
But
So you've got this whole population that's all kind of.
well, but what
No,
what
they're
the book
called.
of
I'm not
Matthew
talking
is,
about.
and it's talking about what makes one an Israelite is believing in the Lord of the covenant.
Yeah.
And so you can't, how could you call yourself a Jew and even deny and say you're an atheist?
Okay.
Now, I mean, even in the broadest sense, you cannot, you might be culturally, we're bound by these traditions or whatever
Yeah.
to some degree or another, but that doesn't make you a Jew. And you say, well, they're Semites. Well, the Palestinians are Semites. They're descendants of Shem.
Yeah.
A lot of the Jewish people are not Semites at all. They're Ashkenazi, and which means they come from somewhere around present-day Ukraine. Interesting how that ties together. But
Yeah.
and Zelensky himself is a Jew.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying they're not Jewish,
No, because they.
but I'm saying that
emigrated
there's
from
not
Ukraine.
necessarily blood. They're not necessarily Semites by blood, although they may have intermarried with Sephardic Jews and stuff. There may be, but all of us have a little bit of the blood of Abraham in us anyway. So it might be very remote, but we're all descendants of Abraham one way or another. So, which talks about the universality of the gospel, by the way, because but anyway, that's for another argument. So anyway. We're going to need to cut this a little bit because we're already running way over on our thing. But we'll talk next week. We'll talk a little bit about, Paul and his Roman citizenship and using that as a means to avoid flogging. Was it because he was afraid of being beaten, or was he caring for make sure that the Chiliarch and the centurion didn't get in trouble for beating an uncondemned Roman? All right, see you next week.
Thanks, Mark.